He would often act out like the Three Stooges. You guys ever watch the Three Stooges? Yeah, okay, that's a little bit different then, but very similar type of comedy. All right, bell ringer for today. All right, so describe famous writer of the 1920s and his or her work. There you go. So we went over a lot of them yesterday. Describe a famous writer in the 1920s and his or her work. There you go. Yeah, 2 more minutes to finish up here. Kevin, you all finished? You all finished? All right. All right, 1 more minute to finish up here. All right, so what do we got here? What do we have? What do we have? Famous writer 1920s and his or her.
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yep.
All in the work of his book, Great Gatsby. So he wrote it back in the 1920s, 1925. How much of a hit? Only sold 25,000 copies. Like after that.
Good, man. What was The Great Gatsby about? Do you remember?
I watched the movie. I remember.
You didn't understand it?
Yeah. Like, wasn't it about a dream in the end?
Yeah, okay. So, anybody want to help him out? Go ahead, Alyssa.
Wasn't it about how like the upper class was trying to like stick it to the lower classes if they have more money?
Yeah, pretty much, right? Just money just being thrown left and right, willy-nilly like, right? And they were just pretty much using their money to kind of stick it to the lower class, like showing them what they had and flaunting their materialistic lifestyle. So the finest wine, alcohol, food, and they had the most expensive clothing, which was just a little ridiculous, the amount of spending that they were doing, and the amount of parties that they had, and it was just a crazy lifestyle. And what was it for? Nothing, right? And the people that were at these parties, did they really like each other? Not much. No, they just wanted to really flaunt about their wealth. Okay, good. Good job. All right. What else we got? What else? Ethan. Yeah, okay. Autumn? Uh, yeah, okay, good job. In literature, right? And what was his great work that we talked about yesterday? The Babbitt, good. And what was that about? Was that? Okay, same thing, right, with materialism. So buying all these new expensive things and conforming to society, right? So conforming to the new modernist idea, this new modernist movement in these big urban areas where they're going out partying, really getting involved in entertainment, spending a lot of money on really, I guess you'd say, I wouldn't say nonsense, but things that just, I guess, made them happy, right? Rather than just kind of going home and spending time with the family and spending money on the family. All right, good, good. Jakari, what do you have?
I did Ernest Hemingway.
Okay, good. What was he all about? What was his famous work?
He wrote The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms.
Good. And what did he describe in those books?
Bad war affected people.
Yeah, right. Good job. So he pretty much criticized the glorification of war. Right. He served in World War One, and he was just trying to describe in his books that war isn't what it's all cracked up to be. It's not a game. It's not something that people go and do for fun. And he was just trying to describe a lot of the effects that the war had on people, and there's its psychological damage, and just really trying to push to many Americans what it was all about. But still, even with World War One, although there's a lot of troops affected by it, a lot of soldiers and American citizens affected by it, not many people still knew what it was all about. Right? They didn't have reporters on the battlefields. They didn't have pictures and videos of things presented to the people, like we'll see more with World War II and the Vietnam War. All right, good job, good job. Are you good with that, guys? All right, cool. So writers in 1920s, make sure you remember that. All right, vocab, real quick. Vocab. I'll post the list here for you then. So if there's any that you're missing, you can kind of fill it in from there. There won't be that many because I went over the whole list pretty much, but just in case I maybe missed one. All right, so the jazz singer, the Harlem Renaissance, and jazz. There you go. So we're going to talk about jazz a lot today. Right, its effect on American society, its culture, and the Harlem Renaissance. So I'll give you a few minutes to jot those down, look up the definitions, and we'll move on. I'm going to post this to the stream then so I can save room with the announcements, okay? So the vocab will probably be on the stream. All right, jazz singer, what do we have? Jazz singer, what do we got? What do we got? Lentz, do you have this one?
American musical drama from 1927.
Okay, good job. That was the first talking movie, right, with sound. Okay, good job. It's 1927, first movie with sound, and I was really just talking about the culture at the time, the sound, the music, okay? And this was really a first appearance of this in American culture. Like I said before, can you imagine life without music everywhere you go? A lot of you listen to put your pods in and listen to music when you're walking down the hallway, sometimes when you're in class. But in these cities, you see bands all across streets, okay, on the radio. They listen to music on the radio. So this was a new environment, a new culture in America where music would follow the people everywhere they go. All right, good job. Harlem Renaissance. What do we have? Harlem Renaissance. We're going to talk about this today. Angel, go ahead.
Intellectual revival of African American art and literature centered in the 1920s.
Awesome, good job. The Harlem Renaissance was, whenever you see Renaissance, some people call it Renaissance. It's just rebirth, okay? Rebirth. It's a rebirth of, in this case, African American culture in the United States, okay? So for so long, throughout, the ending of the Civil War, slavery taking hold, obviously, and then the Great Migration. So after the Civil War ended, many African Americans moved from the South to the North for better opportunity and lifestyle. Okay, and many of these people moved to Harlem, New York, and this is where they really experienced and pushed their culture in America, which jazz resulted out of that. Different forms of artwork, which we're going to talk about today, poetry, you name it. So it's a rebirth of African American culture, a new way of looking at the group of people. Right, jazz. What do we have? What do we have for jazz? Haley Klinger, what do you have for jazz? Awesome, good job. So emerged from African American culture during the Harlem Renaissance, and this was the sound of music during the 1920s. So this was the bee's knees, right? Slang of the 1920s. You ever hear that? The bee's knees? Yeah, that's something that came out in the 1920s. So again, I'll post that list for you on the stream. So if there's any terms you're missing, just fill those out, okay? I think I went over pretty much all of them, but just want to make sure. Okay, moving on here. Oh, I don't want psych. I don't want that. There we go. All right, so those group of people, the writers that we talked about yesterday, they consider themselves in the lost generation, all right? That lost generation, they consider themselves that because they're mostly from what group of people, you think? Traditionalists, fundamentalists, or modernists? Who were they? Fundamentalists or modernists? Go ahead, Haley. Yeah, fundamentalists, good job. They just couldn't imagine the new style of living in the United States, this new cultural shock, right? Where these people were going out and spending their wages on entertainment and really not sitting back and spending time with the family. It was a new way of living in the U.S. So the lost generation, that's what they call themselves, these writers, because they couldn't believe the new shift in American society. Okay, are you guys all good with that? All right, cool. So I know we talked about muckrakers in chapter 1. After things were progressing, right, with the progressive era, writers took a new hold, which is talking about these new forms of movements, these new social groups emerging in the United States. All right, here we go. Last thing here in the 1920s I want to talk about, the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so between 1910 and 1920, the Great Migration saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans move north to big cities. A lot of that because of the Jim Crow laws, okay, in the South. I'm sure you heard a lot about that with Mr. Henninger last year, okay, with the Jim Crow laws. This was something that was trying to continue segregation in the South. Right after the Civil War ended, slavery was over. In many cases, it continued in these small areas and these areas out in the West and in the South. But Jim Crow laws took hold, and segregation was a huge thing. And it was to the point where many African Americans didn't have equality and the opportunities that they're supposed to have. So many African Americans moved north to these bigger cities, especially New York. Okay, Harlem. You guys ever hear the Harlem Globetrotters? Yeah, great basketball team. Yeah, pretty fun to watch. All right, by 1920, over 5 million of the nation's 12 million blacks, over 40%, lived in cities. Okay, so African Americans moved to the cities for better opportunities, better livelihood. I was never in Harlem, but I heard it's awesome. There's artwork everywhere. There's people playing music all across the streets. Okay, great food. All right, you name it. I'll check it out sometime. All right, guys, good with that? So whenever you hear Harlem Renaissance, again, make sure you think of rebirth. All right, this is a new way of thinking of the African American culture. All right, so for so long in America's history, slavery took hold, right? But after the Civil War, there's a new way of looking at the African American culture, and this would be with music. This would be with poetry, artwork, okay, and talking about their lives and how their families grew up throughout these times before the Civil War. You guys good? Okay. All right, so we talked about the NAACP before, all right, with the progressive movement, okay, with W.B. Du Bois looking for education, right, for African Americans to try to bridge that gap between the culture and society in America and make sure that African Americans had the opportunity for education. Okay, in order to try to solve these social issues, many African Americans need the ability to read and write, to discuss their political opinion, and to talk about certain matters with the white culture, right? All right, we talked about Booker T. Washington as well, right? Okay, and how he set up the Tuskegee Institute, which was training African Americans in the vocational skills so they could work hand in hand right next to people of different races. And again, that's what he believed would solve that social issue and problems in American culture. All right, so again, we reviewed this. We talked about this already. This is from chapter 1 when we talked about the NAACP. All right, Marcus Garvey. So this was a unique approach to the segregation in America in the United States. He pretty much said, you know what, if we're not going to be welcome in American culture and society, specifically in these bigger cities, well, we're just going to start our own community. We're going to start our own nation and separate ourselves and build on that segregation away from a white culture and other races in the United States. Okay, he thought, well, we're just going to build on that and just create our own America. Okay, our own America. And he led a lot of movements in the United States, which in some ways were radical, but for the most part, he was just building on that idea that segregation, African Americans weren't welcome in the United States with different races in the U.S. So he said, you know what, we're just going to start our own country, right, in America, where we'll have our own schools, we'll have our own restaurants, okay, our own cities, separate from many of these individuals in the United States. And he called that Pan-Africanism. Make sure you remember that, Pan-Africanism. So this would lead to more movements when we get to the 1950s, 1960s. with the Black Panthers, okay, and things like that. Malcolm X, right? His movements. Sorry, Chris. Sorry about the light. I'll get it. I'll get it then. You guys good with that? Okay, sorry. So Marcus Garvey. Good. All right. So Harlem, New York became the largest black urban community, suffered from overcrowding and unemployment and poverty. Unfortunately, because the North and the way the United States was at that time in society, it was hard for African Americans to find an opportunity for education and jobs, right? And a place in the workplace, in the industries. A lot of it had to do with just because lack of education. Right? But in the 1920s, Harlem was the new place, this rebirth of African American culture, this place where people would look at the African American culture and see it as a revitalization, right, effort, where poetry, music, okay, artwork would be used to express their culture. And this opened the eyes to many Americans, especially with, we'll talk about today with Louis Armstrong, with his trumpet, okay, and Duke Ellington playing piano. Amazing talents that these people had, which really allowed more Americans to be accepting of African Americans in culture, just because the entertainment alone. These people were bigger than ever. They ranked up there with Babe Ruth himself, just because how famous they were with their talents in the music and poetry and artwork. So again, the Harlem Renaissance was a rebirth, a revival of African American culture and perspective in the U.S. You guys good with that? Okay, so here's a picture. It just really describes the 1920s. Okay, as music was getting bigger, jazz, okay, artwork, poetry. This was a way to push these social groups, these different races together, and culture. All right, so I'm going to talk about Langston Hughes here. So I was going to skip that slide here. I want to talk about Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes was one of the biggest movements, best poet, okay, and he talked about the difficult times in the working class African Americans. You know how hard it was for these people to find jobs and opportunities in their new environment, especially in the North in these larger cities. There was still a time where many employers wouldn't hire African Americans. A lot of it because maybe lack of education, maybe because these people didn't view them as equal. Okay. It was just the time period at that, during the time. So Langston Hughes described these events and these problems that many African Americans face with segregation in the United States, and he put them in poems and jazz music and in blues. As I'm sure you heard blues before, that type of music, that genre. So a lot of these artists, a lot of these famous African American poets, songwriters describe the harsh reality of societal issues in the United States. So Langston Hughes, poet, talked about the difficult lives of the working class. No opportunities, right? Okay, guys, good with that? All right. So Zora Hurston, she was also a poet. She wrote novels, books, and she described some of the issues with African Americans in Southern schools, how segregation was pushing these people to harder times. Right? Although they had the right to an education, many of these people suffered because of Many of the buildings weren't built to code. A lot of these schools were, used in old factories or old businesses and old industries, I guess you could say. And textbooks weren't up to date. It was to the point they were trying to teach with no literature, no academic value to it, really. It was just hard. It was a struggle at first. And she wrote about some of these problems and issues that many of these African Americans are facing in Southern schools. How there was no funding. Many of these schools didn't have an ability to feed their students. No extracurricular activities, so no sports, no band lessons, you name it. So Zora Hurston talked about the inequalities in education, specifically in Southern schools for African Americans. All right, guys, good with that? All right, real quick, I'll move here. Louis Armstrong, probably one of the most famous African Americans of the time, the 1920s. Okay, his trumpet, he was one of the biggest stars of the 1920s when it came to music. He's considered the most important and influential musician of the jazz era of the 1920s. He would go to many of these places like the Cotton Club or these big balls, these big areas where wealthy elite people of the 1920s would get together, these huge parties. And Louis Armstrong would always be the entertainment. He was the biggest name by far of the 1920s. The main thing to remember from him, Louis Armstrong, the trumpet, one of the biggest jazz stars of the time. You guys good with that? Okay, last one here, Duke Ellington. All right, Duke Ellington was a famous pianist. You guys ever hear of him in Big Mouth, I'm guessing? You guys watch Big Mouth? Yeah. So he was one of the biggest musicians at the time, along with Louis Armstrong. Okay, he was considered one of America's greatest composers. Okay, and again, he was famous for his piano. And again, music, poetry, artwork, that was a way to try to bring culture, society, races together in the United States, especially in the 1920s. Right, as slavery was ending, as industrialization was becoming bigger, and these urban areas were forming, music, artwork, poetry was a way to bring people together. Entertainment. I think we all can admire that with sports, music, or many of these individuals can show their true talents and bring groups of people together, solve some issues with social unrest, right? And bring opportunities for the people of all races in the United States. All right, finally, Bessie Smith here. Last one, last slide. Yep, I can. Good. All right, so Bessie Smith, last one here. So she was famous because she was a famous singer, okay, of the 1920s. Again, artwork, music. This was a way to try to bring people together, and her amazing talent at singing all across these big these big clubs, not even bars, different entertainment centers, over the radio. Okay, many of these African Americans saw their talent and brought again the United States together. I think we can all admire that and think even today with entertainment like sports. A lot of times with the NFL, NBA, even musicians talking about struggles in life and how to move forward, how to move past, and unite society. All right, there you go. There you go. So I do have a reading on jazz, okay, the Harlem Renaissance. I'll post that now. I'll play the video tomorrow for the bell ringer for the start of class. So we're all on the same page now. Sound good? Okay. Okay. So let me post that for you right now.